Okay. I was just given an error that my attempt to go live failed, but I went live even though I got the error. Confusing times for all of us, I'm sure. You are wondering where my esteemed business partner and colleague, Dr. Kristen, is. She's on holiday. She's actually taking some time off, which, if you know Kristen at all, is a miracle. So she is currently on her way to dinner with friends in Belfast, and I am so thrilled that she is getting this opportunity to catch up with people that we love. And I am more than happy to take this today's slate of empathy exercises. Um, yeah, I mean, we've got we've got some doozies. We've got some good ones, and then y'all, I had to make notes in a separate Google Doc on one of them because it was that complicated and it was that important for me to get it right. So, without further ado, okay. Welcome to Tuesday, July 26th. I'm very upset by the fact that July is almost over, but there's very little I can do uh, about that. What I can do with is share with you our empathy exercises for today. So first up, since I'm doing all of them, they're all coming from me, but I will indicate the ones which Kristen put in here. And we even have one from our Canadian correspondent, Jay, who is doing a bang up job sending us things that need to be empathy exercises. So a helpful reminder to anybody else, if you come across something that you think would be a great empathy exercise for us, either on our Tuesday lives or on our clubhouse room on Fridays at 10 a.m., DM us, add us on Twitter or any other social media, and let us know. So first up is from me, from Native News Online, and it is an article about a new exhibition from Indigenous photographer, Dene photographer, specifically Will Wilson. And it's a wonderful article, but it really goes into this idea that like we have this perception of Native American people that is still widely held in the United States, that especially the visual image of them is this like tin type sepia tones by a photographer named Edward Curtis, who went around and documented a lot of Indigenous folks in early photography. But that kind of idea freezes them in time and in the past in a way that is inaccurate. And so Will has a new exhibition I'm just looking, it opened July 9th at the Delaware Art Museum. So if you are anywhere near in the state of Delaware or near the state of Delaware, I highly recommend this exhibition, which investigates the legacy of historical photographs. And Wilson said specifically, people don't want to deal with the traumatic reality of history, of genocide, of attempted ethnic cleansing. They'd rather see these noble, beautiful images of a better time. I want to make the case that we're still here doing interesting and important things. So they're all contemporary portraits of Indigenous folks who love comic books or who are artists or musicians or all of the various things that humans can be. So it's a great empathy exercise to kind of remind folks that Indians have been around for a very long time. We are all on native land, and they continue to exist and contribute to humanity in lots of different ways outside of the stereotypes that we know them with. So empathy exercise numero 1. I didn't think of a transition for this one. But next up is from myself as well. And it's this news piece that I found in the New York Times about specifically the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina is blocking the use of gender inclusive language in schools. And this sounds, on its face like it might be simply an issue of people not recognizing gender fluidity, but it really has more to do with, in this instance, with the speaking of the Spanish language and the structure of the language itself. So it is the first policy anywhere to specifically forbid the use of gender neutral language. Amazing that the United States didn't get on the jump and be the first with that. And it goes against the state policy, Argentina's state policy. But a lot of the debate is that, in Romance languages, including Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, grammar is all gendered. And so a lot of people are complaining that, like, they're damaging the language by creating gender neutral language. And so for me, the empathy exercise with this one, I think, is, yeah, sure, it's historic to the formation of the Spanish language, but language changes and evolves all the time. And if we want to build inclusive communities around the world, I think we have to figure out a way to make that language more inclusive. And our dear Quebecois Canadian correspondent Jay has said French managed to create a gender neutral pronoun. So again, it's possible to do it. It's inclusive to do it. But I thought this was interesting in that they were making the argument more about the language than specifically about whether or not they believe humans can be gender neutral or identify as gender neutral. So I thought that one was interesting and worth taking note that these debates are happening all over the world for lots of different reasons. Something that is not happening all over the world, but is happening here in the United States, is exciting news on the empathy field of representation, in which Lieutenant General Michael E. Langley is up for nomination to make him the first Black 4-star general in the 246-year history of the U.S. Marine Corps. Yeah. I mean, that just kind of speaks for itself in terms of empathy. Representation is a huge part of that, understanding people's different lived experiences as different humans and colors and shapes and forms. So he has yet to be confirmed. He has to do a confirmation hearing in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee on Thursday this week. So we hopefully will have an update for you on our Friday Clubhouse that he has been confirmed. But hats off, salutes to Lieutenant General Langley, and an exciting move towards more equitable representation in the Marines. Not an exciting move at all towards equity. And this one comes also from Dr. Kristen. I forgot to say that last one came from Kristen as well. And this is about a University of Utah report that admitted, quote unquote, shortcomings in its response to domestic abuse. I would say shortcomings is not strong enough language for what happened, because the document shows that delays and missteps in the school's efforts to address the crisis of it was domestic abuse that turned into murder, intimate partner murder, and a young woman named Zifan Dong, who was murdered by her boyfriend Hayu Wang last year. And so, earlier this year. And her parents are speaking out saying, we trusted the University of Utah with our daughter's safety, and they betrayed that trust because they had warnings that she was in danger and failed to protect her. So this is an empathy exercise to remember that we have to hold institutions accountable, and that institutions in a lot of ways are policy driven, not people driven. And so we encourage the University of Utah to reflect on these failings. I'm going to use the word failings instead of shortcomings, to see how they can be more human focused and less policy focused. I mean, they all have to go through policies and legal issues and whatnot, but clearly they failed this young woman in not having a system in place that was supportive of the accusations being made against her eventual killer. Speaking of accusations, this one is from Dr. Kristen as well. And we have some accusations of inhumane working conditions on Netflix's show Love is Blind. The accusations are coming from Jeremy Hartwell, this lovely young man pictured here, who appeared in the second series of the show. I have not watched this show, but if you don't know what the show is, like, people date without ever seeing the person. So they're in like two separate rooms, and the rooms are their videos on them, but they don't see each other. And so they have to have conversations and get to know each other without seeing the person in front of them. And they're encouraged to, similarly to like all dating shows, like The Bachelorette and The Bachelor, they're encouraged to like get engaged. And that's only when they're able to see each other, is after they get engaged, which I just find disturbing. But Jeremy is claiming that the producers encouraged the cast to drink alcohol while limiting access to food and water. He also says that he had to fight off the effects of sleep deprivation after long hours filming under bright lights. This is not the first time we've had accusations of this for particularly the filming of dating shows. There's a lot of accusations that have come out against The Bachelor and The Bachelorette series for kind of the conditions that they put contestants in that may or may not be healthy or good for them. So Netflix is denying all the allegations. They're quote unquote absolutely no merit to them. But it was filed in the Superior Court of California in Los Angeles, and it names both Netflix and Kinetic Content as defendants. So we will keep an eye on this and see what happens once the case comes to court, and see how it is adjudicated. But I mean, an empathy exercise that we don't really know a lot about how these shows are made, and it's important to ask more questions about how they are made and what kind of environment people are being put in and whether they're consenting to it. Obviously, they consent to be participants in the show, but to what extent are those circumstances being communicated? So we will put a pin in that, as we say, and keep an eye on it. In exciting representation news, I came across this article in Business Insider about Avery Bishop, who made history as the first Asian American Miss Texas winner. So she will go on to represent the state of Texas in the Miss America competition. She is a first-generation law school student and has over 850,000 fans on TikTok. And this article is a wonderful kind of profile on how she uses her platform to talk about legal issues, but also to talk about diversity and inclusion and representation. And she was very intentional about bringing attention to and highlighting her engagement and membership in the Asian community, where she comes from. And then if you scroll down a little bit further, I learned for the first time, I was today years old, when I learned that, unsurprisingly, up until 1940, the seventh rule, oh boy, Insider freaked out. but we're going to just let that go. Lord, up until 1940, yes, there we go. The seventh rule of the Miss America rulebook read, contestants must be of good health and of the white race. Yikes on bikes. So happy for representation. It's a big deal that Avery won, and I don't really follow pageants very much, but I wish her all the best. We can have a whole separate discussion about whether or not pageants are healthy for gender norms and stereotypes, perhaps another time. I feel like I am now perhaps missing an empathy exercise. Y'all, I shouldn't be allowed to do this by myself. I kid. Let me just double check here that I have all of those because they was freaking out. All right. I don't want to miss any important story. Yeah, cool. We're grand. Love it. Okay, next up is directly from Canadian correspondent Jay, which is an update on Hockey Canada's ongoing crisis with institutional abuse and instances of abuse that the institution did or did not know about. There was news that broke at the end of last week of another alleged group sexual assault from 2003 involving members of the 2002-2003 national junior team. So it was first reported by Rick Westhead of TSN. And so this is Hockey Canada's statement in response to it. Give it a read. Again, they are claiming that they did not have knowledge of this and that they are not only committed to adjudicating these particular issues, but also, I think importantly, the statement says, committed to bringing an end to the culture of silence in hockey, which is a huge, huge part of why people do and do not report instances of assault and abuse and violence. And Jay also sent me a DM for an ongoing trial that's happening in British Columbia of a former NHL player who's been accused of assault. And the way that the defendants, the players' lawyer, was talking to the alleged victim in a way asking her why she didn't do more to stop the assault from happening. I believe it was like, why didn't she fake like some kind of like abdominal distress, or like, so like tell me she was menstruating or that she had like diarrhea. I don't remember the specifics, but he was asking her why she didn't do more, and her response was brilliant. Her response was, I said no and pushed him off me. Like, I felt like that was sufficient. So because of accusations like that, there is a culture of silence in a lot of institutions, and especially in ways in which the institutions are more likely to protect themselves rather than admit full capability. And so, again, we're keeping an eye on Hockey Canada to see how they plan on bringing an end to this culture of silence. It's real hard to make that kind of cultural change. They released as well last week their action plan to improve Canada's game. So that is linked in the Hockey Canada statement as well. So if you're interested in it, that's where you can find it. Yes, Jay, thank you. Reminds me that it was why she didn't fake having her period. Was what the defense attorney had asked the alleged victim, which is just disturbing on so many levels. But speaking of institutional abuse and holding institutions accountable, this is the long empathy exercise for the day. And this is the one that I hinted at that I had to like take notes for. Because I wanted to make sure that I got the timeline right. I wanted to make sure that I got the pronunciation right of the Indigenous groups that were involved in this. But in case you didn't see, it was trending on Twitter yesterday, but it didn't quite make the national news here in the United States, at least the news that I watched. Pope Francis is currently visiting Canada and parts of Canada. And yesterday, in a visit with Indigenous representatives, apologized, sort of. So let's get into it. There's going to be a heck of a lot of links in the downstairs, breaking down all of the different aspects of this. Jay says, she almost sent it to me, but figured she needs something to send happy next. We live in the dark and dreary, Jay. I've told you this. But yeah, I can imagine it was quite covered in the news a lot up in Canada. I got a lot of my sources from Canadian news sources. So I would like to see it covered down here because we also have residential school and institutional abuse issues when it comes to colonizing and cultural genocide of Indigenous folks. But this CBC article here is really great. And then I have this one from Indigenews as well, by Kara McKenna. So be sure and check those out. There's a lot to take in with this. So I'm going to bring up my notes now. So if you didn't know any of this, there's a lot of parts, moving parts to this empathy exercise. We've talked about residential schools. We've talked about residential schools in Canada throughout this year and last year for lots of reasons, particularly because several mass graves have been recently found in the last year and a half, and that has made the news and brought up a lot of this stuff again. So in case you didn't know, Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the relationship of the Canadian government and other institutions with and the treatment of Indigenous Canadians. And in 2015, the commission called for a papal apology to be delivered to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Metis children in Catholic-run residential schools. So that's a lot of intersections of abuse happening, and that's important for the news of the day. The commission also called for this apology to be delivered on Canadian soil. So that was 2015, but it was only really until after the 2021 discovery of the remains of around 200 children at the former Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia, which we covered in our empathy exercises when that happened, that the Vatican started to mobilize to comply with that request from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Canadian government has admitted that physical and sexual abuse were rampant in state-funded Christian schools that operated from the 19th century to the 1970s. Estimates of over 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and forced to attend in an effort to isolate them from the influence of their homes, their native languages and cultures, and assimilate them into Canada's primarily Christian society. So that's the legacy of the residential schools. The Canadian government's involvement in it, the Prime Minister at the time issued a formal apology at the time in 2008 as a part of a lawsuit settlement involving the government, churches, and approximately 90,000 surviving students. Canada paid reparations that amounted to billions of dollars being transferred to Indigenous communities. Canada's Catholic Church says it has dioceses and religious orders that have provided more than $50 million in cash and in-kind contributions and hope to add more to that. So that's the background story of this. And then again this year on the 1st of April, we had a story where the Pope met in Rome with members of the Metis, Inuit, and First Nations communities and issued the first apology to Indigenous folks. And so the quote from that apology was, "For the deplorable conduct of those members of the Catholic Church, I ask forgiveness of the Lord. And I want to tell you from my heart that I am greatly pained, and I unite myself with the Canadian bishops in apologizing." So again, this apology is massive. It's massive. But the part of the language I want to point out there is that he says, the deplorable conduct of those members of the Catholic Church. So in his first apology, he did not recognize necessarily the institution of the Catholic Church itself and its complicitness in this systemic cultural genocide. At this point, it's worth noting that nearly 3/4 of Canada's 130 residential schools were run by Catholic-aligned missionary organizations. So we do have, this is a complicated story, y'all, and if you're sticking with me, God love you. We do have some Indigenous representation within the Catholic Church, and within specifically even the papal visit, that are working on this. So it's a messy situation, and in a lot of ways it shows a lot of effort, but there's still a lot of criticisms for what this visit hasn't done and what the apology hasn't done. So the Reverend Christino Bouvet, who's the National Liturgical Coordinator of the papal visit, and is partly of Indigenous heritage, says he hopes the visit is healing for those who have, quote, borne a wound, a cross that they have suffered with, in some cases for generations. In many cases for generations. Bouvet, who is a priest of the Diocese of Calgary in Alberta, said the papal liturgical events will have strong Indigenous representation, including prominent roles for Indigenous clergy, use of native languages, music and motifs, etc. So they are focused on kind of representation, and there were a lot of Native and Indigenous leaders present for yesterday's apology. And so we get to what happened yesterday, which was the papal visit, included so it was the papal visit in Muskogee, which is in Alberta. And so the visit included a visit to the Ermineskin Cree Nation Cemetery in front of the chiefs of the Four Nations of the Muskogees, which is the Bear Hills tribe in Alberta, and the site of the former Ermineskin Indian Residential School, which was one of the largest in the country. And the apology was made at the powwow grounds of Muskogees, which is south of Edmonton in Alberta, if you care about geography. So there were hundreds of First Nations, Metis, and Inuit residential school survivors and their families that were there. And so now we're going to get to the guts of the papal apology, because it's worth looking at the language of this, especially in terms of understanding why this is such a messy empathy exercise. So the Pope spoke in Spanish. It was translated into English, and he said he was deeply sorry for the ways in which, regrettably, many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppressed the Indigenous peoples. I ask forgiveness in particular for the ways in which many members of the church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in this system of residential schools. Although Christian charity was not absent and there were many outstanding instances of devotion and care for children, the overall effects of the policies linked to the residential schools were catastrophic. I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the Indigenous peoples. Right. So very clearly a strategic parsing of language, which, a lot of people would like to consider that the Pope is above politics, but every institution is political. And whoo boy is the Catholic Church and the papacy and the Holy See super political and always has been. And so for me, I mean, I didn't listen to the whole speech, but I read a lot of excerpts, and it sounds like he was speaking very much from an individual stance and not from an institutional stance. And I find that troubling because he's not there as an individual. He is there as the head of the Catholic Church for the whole world. And for him to use language in which he talks about the Christians that did this and the members of the church and of religious communities that cooperated and the government that was involved in it, without ever saying the church as an institution supported these people. So he says all of these members of the church did this. But how did they do this? They did it because they were supported by the institution of the church. So a lot of feedback and criticism of this apology has come from the fact that it is not recognizing the church's complicity in this. So another big thing that happened I'm going to share my screen one more time. In the apology was this moment here in which Pope Francis was presented with a traditional headdress by Chief Wilton Littlechild. And people were very, again, divided on whether or not this was a good thing. So I kind of wanted to address some of what I found in terms of people's understanding of that. So Wilton Littlechild is the honorary chief of Ermineskin First Nation, and he gave the Pope this ceremonial headdress. Wilton is a former commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and heard thousands of testimony from former students of residential schools. And he gave him this headdress. And one of the comments I found on Twitter that I thought was really helpful from a person named Emily Riddle was that I don't know how I feel about, this is what Emily said, I don't know how I feel about the Pope receiving a headdress, but you have to know that the gifting protocol for the Nihuoak, I apologize, Nehioic, which is the Plains Cree word for the Cree people. I apologize to the Cree people for my butchering of that. But the gifting protocol isn't only about the recipient, it's about the person giving the gift wanting to open the mind of the person receiving it. It places two people in relationship. So I thought that was a really important part of that, to kind of understand the origins of that gift. That being said, there were a lot of Indigenous folks that I saw that were very upset about it. So, there is no one response to this. I do have to say that the Pope did acknowledge that an apology on its own is not adequate. And so there's some language in his step that this is the first step. This is the starting point. There will be an investigation into the facts that took place and to assist the survivors. And I mean, yeah, great. But there has been an investigation, and that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in part doing. And we have a lot of this information already. We have a lot of these facts already. And so to imply that we don't have these facts already and that we have to somehow seek out the truth of what happened when there are so many Inuit First Nations and Metis groups that have come together and organized to bring testimonies of victims and survivors. They testified to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, I would direct Papa Frank and the Catholic Church to, I don't know, read the documents that exist and start there, because there's already a lot of fact collecting that's been done. And so, again, very, very messy. So this visit to Musqueam is a part of a 6-day penitential pilgrimage, which is quite fancy language. where he is also visiting Quebec City and Iqaluit, which is very far north somewhere, I believe. And so the last bit of this empathy exercise that I wanted to touch on was kind of the reaction that I am seeing from a lot of Indigenous folks in newspaper articles and on Twitter. And I kind of wanted to collate some of them to kind of give a sense of the feelings and emotions that are around this. You might have seen one of the most powerful video clips I've seen in a good long while was of a Cree woman singing "O Canada" in Cree at the ceremony and sobbing while she did it. And just such a visceral representation of pain and trauma and suffering. And so a lot of this has brought up questions about, whether or not this was healing for people and what healing means. And so you have a lot of people who are unhappy with the apology because it does not mention the role of the institution itself. None of his apologies have specifically mentioned abuse or sexual abuse, which is a huge, huge part of the overall trauma of the residential schools. The Assembly of First Nations Chief Roseanne Archibald said that the apology fell short on many fronts because it was not on behalf of the Catholic Church, which is what we were hoping for. So I think that's a really big part of that puzzle piece that was missing. And then some other folks on Twitter, this one person, I'm sorry, the name is not in English in a way in which I can pronounce it and or share it. It appears to be in an Indigenous language, and I apologize for not being able to use your name. But they said, the apology of actions of many members does not equate to the entire church. That is an important distinction. The apology frames the harm of residential schools as the unfortunate error of individuals and not the coordinated intent of genocide by the Catholic Church, the papacy, and the Holy See. And I think that's such a huge distinction when we're talking about this. All of his language, both in April of this year and yesterday, frames it as individuals or organizations that were connected to the Catholic Church or that had people in it who were members of the Catholic Church, but not the Catholic Church itself as an institution. And so the question then becomes like, what is healing and what is justice when we're looking at something so massive that spans an entire century, that has over 150,000 victims and survivors. Even more than that, because it was 150,000 children who were forcibly taken and forcibly assimilated. So, all their families and their communities and their relatives and relations all around the land that is now Canada were impacted by that. And there was so much intergenerational trauma that was talked about a lot in a lot of the articles that I read. And the last point I want to make about this was from Cindy Blackstock, also on Twitter, who said, the healing narrative puts the work back on the victims. We need to talk about the justice narrative, as there is more healing to be done by the offender than the victim. And I think, we talk about institutional abuse all the time here, and we talk about healing and we talk about justice and what that looks like and how there is no monolithic entity of humans ever. And so we can't say there is one right response to this level of trauma. There are victims and survivors that feel that yesterday's apology was a part of their healing, that feel better. There are people that felt traumatized by it. There are people that are upset about it. There's a whole spectrum of emotion, and everybody, we need to recognize and give space for everybody to have the emotional reaction that they're going to have about this. And it can make it very difficult then to adjudicate a situation like this, in which there are so many people involved and so many perspectives on what justice looks like and what healing looks like. So it's really, important to remember kind of the scope of something like this. And, we often say, like, we start with holding institutions accountable. And it can't be understated that it was a massive, massive step for the Pope to apologize in April, to apologize now. But just because it was a massive step doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical of it, and doesn't mean we should keep asking questions and providing as much space as possible for uplifting and supporting the voices of victims and survivors of the residential schools. And Jay said she saw an interesting piece yesterday talking about how they need to translate the apology into various Indigenous languages that have almost disappeared, so many elders will never hear it in their native tongues. Yeah, so I mean, that's also a part of this, right? Is that, they had a lot of representation. They were on Cree land yesterday, largely speaking. And so they had a lot of representation from Cree leaders and also other Indigenous leaders from around Alberta and parts of Canada. But there's a lot of people that need to hear this message. And, a lot of elders who won't hear it because the language is in such a deteriorated state that there aren't enough speakers to translate it. Because that was all part of the cultural assimilation, and the cultural genocide was this like destruction of the native and Indigenous languages. And, that's a really great point that Jay made. And I also saw lots of people talking about all of the people who were not able to hear that apology or to see this happen because they're dead, and the trauma of all of the humans who went through that abuse and who died died by suicide, suffered from addiction and died from the disease of addiction, alcoholism, so many other ways that this trauma manifests in the human body and in the human mind. And so I know it was so emotional for so many people yesterday because there were so many folks who weren't there to see that. And so it is this question of what does it mean to reconcile? What does reconciliation mean? What does it mean to represent folks? And to, I think, in this stage, always to center the victims and survivors and their family members and the Indigenous folks who have been so traumatized by this, and to know that that is the most important part of what we can do in terms of empathy and recognizing this impact that is happening to so many of our neighbors across the border, but also happening a lot in the United States. And so this is something we are always going to talk about here on our empathy exercises, because a lot of people aren't talking about it because it seems like something that is outside of our scope of understanding. But, residential schools happened in Canada. They happened in the United States. Current Secretary for the Interior, Deb Haaland, has commissioned an investigation into U.S. residential schools. So we will keep talking about this here. But certainly our hearts go out to and stand in solidarity with all the victims and survivors and all the Métis, First Nations, and Inuit folks who went through yesterday and experienced yesterday and this ongoing papal trip. We can't speak to healing. We can't speak to experiences or justice. Those aren't our questions to answer. Those aren't our statements to make. But we we stand with in solidarity those folks and what they've been through. Whew, that was a long one. I knew it was going to be. Thank you, Jay, for sticking with me and whoever else is out there on the Replay crew. I managed to save something delightful for last because I knew after going through all of that in the detail that I wanted to make sure that I went through it in, we were all going to need something happy to end today's empathy exercises with. So I bring you the Scottish Tree Hugging Championships. It's the first time it ever happened. The inaugural Scottish Tree Hugging Championships were held in Ardtornish on Lochaber's Movern Peninsula, and included events such as hugging as many trees in a minute and freestyle the most inventive hugging way to hug a tree. Excuse me. So we've got pictures of people hugging trees in different ways. Look, I quite like that one. That's very creative. This guy is real spiritual with the tree there. I like it. We've got upside down lady here. And here we have the winner, which, I mean, let's be honest, look at his outfit. Alistair Firth, who won the first annual Scottish tree hugging competition. And I mean, humans. Look, there's Alistair there, hugging the tree and loving it. Loving life, being just being honest with who they are and how much they love trees. I think it's fantastic. Hi, Brenda. So glad you were able to make it for live and join us live. And yes, I agree. It sounds like a very fun idea, and it sounds very, very Scottish. Although the article did say that they got support from the Finnish Tree Hugging Championships, which again also sounds very Finnish. But yeah, I thought we could all use a smile after 20 odd minutes on residential schools and papal apologies. But, Dr. Kristen and I always say, first do no harm, then do you. So there is absolutely zero harm in getting real excited about hugging trees. And so we love to see that kind of experience. And, that can only teach us to just be more empathetic about understanding different humans and what makes them tick and what makes them happy. And I'm just so delighted to I just keep looking over and seeing Alistair so happy hugging the tree. So that is our empathy exercises for today, including a very, very long one, which again, if you know me at all, I feel very passionately about representing and telling the stories that Indigenous people are telling and want attention to. So I hope y'all have a great week. If you want to join us on Clubhouse on Friday, get the app. Friday we'll have more and different empathy exercises, including another one from Jay, who's doing such a great job of helping us out. Do all the YouTube-y things. If you're finding us for the first time, hello. If you're watching this on replay, please let us know where you're watching it from, and be sure to comment even after it's done airing live, and we will engage in conversation with you. I hope y'all have a great day, and Dr. Kristen and I will be back next week. She'll be back from Ireland and hella jet lagged, but I believe the both of us will be present on Tuesday, so we will see you then. Take care, everybody.